Now let's take a look at the eye and your sense of vision. We rely on vision more than any other special sense. Our visual receptors are contained in the eyes, and these are elaborate structures that enable us to detect not only light but detailed images. We'll start a discussion of the eye with the accessory structures. The eyelids and their associated exocrine glands will be first. Then we're going to discuss the superficial epithelium of the eye and structures associated with production, secretion, and removal of tears. And last, the extrinsic eye muscles. So these are all of these accessory structures are aimed to provide protection, lubrication, and support of the eye. The eyelids are a continuation of the skin, and they act like windshield wipers when they blink, which keeps the surface of the eye lubricated and free of dust and debris. Or they can close tightly and protect the delicate surface of the eye. Upper and lower eyelids join at the medial canthus and the lateral canthus. At the medial canthus, we have a soft mass of tissue, the lacrimal caruncle, which contains glands that produce thick secretions. If any of these sebaceous glands become infected, a painful swelling known as a stye can develop. The conjunctiva is a thin, transparent membrane that covers the inner surface of the eyelids and the outer white surface of the eye up to the edge of the cornea, a transparent part of the outer fibrous layer of the eye. The cornea is covered by a delicate corneal epithelium, which is continuous with the conjunctiva. Irritation or damage to the conjunctiva is called conjunctivitis, otherwise known as pink eye. The lacrimal apparatus is composed of the lacrimal gland, lacrimal canals, and nasolacrimal duct. The lacrimal gland secretes tears and is superior and lateral to the eyeball. Tears reduce friction, remove debris, prevent bacterial infection with the enzyme lysozyme, and they provide nutrients and oxygen to the conjunctiva. Tears drain through two pores in the medial canthus called the lacrimal canals and into the nasolacrimal duct. So this is a great figure showing the placement of some of the accessory structures of the eye. The lateral canthus is on the outer side of the eye, whereas the medial canthus is closer to the nose or the middle of the face. And next to the medial canthus, note the lacrimal caruncle, which makes that gritty sand like sleep. This figure illustrates the otherwise hidden lacrimal apparatus. The lacrimal gland generates those tears, and the lacrimal gland ducts transport the tears to the surface of the eye. The tears then are drained by the lacrimal pores into lacrimal canals and down the nasolacrimal duct and into the nasal cavity. This figure is showing the 6 oculomotor muscles that control the position of the eye. They include the superior rectus, superior oblique, medial rectus, inferior oblique, and lateral rectus. The orbit of the eye contains the lacrimal glands, the extrinsic eye muscles, cranial nerves and blood vessels, as well as any orbital fat cushions that provide a little bit of give to the eye. The eyeball itself is a hollow organ, and it is divided into 2 cavities, the posterior and anterior cavity. The posterior cavity is filled with jelly-like vitreous body or vitreous humor. The anterior cavity has 2 additional subdivisions, the anterior and posterior chambers. The entire anterior cavity is filled with aqueous humor. The wall of the eye contains 3 distinct layers, the outer fibrous layer, an intermediate vascular layer, and a deeper inner layer called the retina. The fibrous layer provides mechanical support, protection, serves as an attachment site for eye muscles, and assists in the focusing process. It's composed of the sclera and cornea. The sclera, or the white of the eye, is a supportive dense connective tissue made of collagen and elastin fibers. The cornea is continuous with the sclera, but the collagen fibers are organized into layers that don't interfere with the passage of light, meaning they're transparent. The vascular layer contains blood and lymphatic vessels and the intrinsic eye muscles. Functions are to provide a route for vessels supplying the tissues, adjusting the amount of light entering the eye, and providing a route for secreting and reabsorbing aqueous humor. They're also responsible for controlling the shape of the lens. Structures of the vascular layer include the iris with the pupillary muscles that change the size of the pupil and the window of the eye. The ciliary body, which contains the ciliary muscles and the ciliary processes, and the suspensory ligaments, which adjust the shape of the lens for focusing, as well as the choroid, a highly vascularized tissue. The inner layer is also called the retina. The inner layer includes a pigmented part, which absorbs light, a neural part, which contains photoreceptors, and supportive cells and neurons, as well as blood vessels. So photoreceptors are cells that detect light. The eye has two types of photoreceptors: rods, which are used in dim light and are found on the periphery of the retinal surface, and cones. Cones are used typically for bright light, and they provide us with the capacity to see differences in color. Cones are typically found in the macula, the center, which is the fovea, or the fovea centralis. Rods and cones synapse with bipolar cells. So the rods and cones here are pictured as kind of a taupe brown and blue. And the bipolar cells are pictured as this kind of pinkish purple in the middle. These bipolar cells then synapse with the ganglion cells, which are pictured in blue. And these ganglion cells, axons, are going to leave the back of the eye through the optic disc. And this is really the origin of the optic nerve. Now, since the optic disc doesn't have any rods or cones, this creates a blind spot. The optic disc is a blind spot in the retina. The anterior cavity, as I said earlier, is filled with the aqueous humor, and this is produced by the ciliary processes. The anterior chamber extends from the cornea to the iris, and the posterior chamber is between the iris and the lens. So the anterior cavity and the aqueous humor is responsible for maintaining pressure in the eye. That aqueous humor does drain out through the scleral venous sinus. The posterior cavity is filled with the vitreous body or vitreous humor, and that is responsible for holding the retina in place up against the choroid coat and the sclera. So this is a nice figure showing the deviations or the differences in the anterior cavity and the anterior chamber and posterior chamber of the anterior cavity. Notice how this figure has a really nice picture of the lens. I really like this picture because you can see the concentric layers of the cells that make up the lens. So keep in mind that the lens is wrapped in a very dense fibrous capsule with many elastic fibers that makes the lens very spherical. This is also a nice figure that shows the suspensory ligaments that's holding the lens in place, suspended from the ciliary processes. So speaking of the lens, the primary function of the lens is to focus the visual image on the photoreceptors. And it does this by changing shape, becoming more rounded or more flattened. So as light passes through different substances like air or water, it's bent or refracted. And so as it enters the cornea and the lens, it'll be refracted so that light rays converge on the retina at a focal point on the fovea. In order for your eye to focus on far away objects, the ciliary muscles relax and the elastic capsule flattens the lens. For close objects, the lens accommodates by rounding when the ciliary muscles contract, as pictured here. And so that brings us to the end of our special sense of vision. I have a couple questions for you before we move on to the next recording, which talks about the special senses of equilibrium and hearing found in the ear.